Bob Baker's name might not mean a lot to people who live outside of LA, but virtually every Angelino knows who Bob was. Bob devoted his life to puppeteering, and through his Bob Baker Marionette Theater, he delighted probably millions of kids over the years. It's still the longest running marionette theater in the country. Whenever Hollywood seemed to need a specialist in puppeteering, they turned to Bob, it seemed, in TV and film and so forth. His legacy continues from the sublime, with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, to the at least semi-ridiculous Monster from the Ocean Floor. Bob had actually been building puppets and puppeteering them from the time he was a kid, and he started work in the movies very early. One of his earliest movie jobs was in the film Bluebeard, by Edgar Ulmer, the master filmmaker who did, among other things, The Black Cat and Detour. In the film, John Carradine is a mad puppeteer who at one point puts on a marionette show of Faust. And it's an extraordinary scene, very, very memorable. And Bob did it when, as I said, he was basically a teenager. One thing that you'll continually see through Bob's career as a puppeteer in film and television is how distinctive each and every one of these jobs was. They called on him to do so many different things. One of Bob's other early jobs was as in his own words, a flunky on George Pal's Puppetoons, which were filmed at Pal's studio in McCadden in Hollywood. These were stop-motion shorts from the 1940s, shot in gorgeous Technicolor. It wasn't the standard stop motion that we know now of displacement animation, where a figure is moved at one frame at a time, single figure. In replacement animation, they would have a whole series of different bodies, different legs, different heads, and so forth, and change them throughout the film. As an animator, Bob's most memorable contribution to the Puppetoons was doing a little intro bumper of the main Puppetoon characters walking together around a little kind of conical display. It says either George Pal's Madcap Models or Puppetoons. And it's a simple piece of animation. They're just going through what they called the walk cycles, but it's very, very memorable. He did all kinds of other jobs for Pal. And he said in one interview that he had the choice of either approaching Walt Disney for a job or George Pal, and he chose Pal. Disney would figure into his career many times later on. Bob was fairly regularly called in to do marionettes as marionettes in various movies and TV shows. In the Elvis Presley vehicle GI Blues, there's a scene where Elvis sings a song called Wooden Heart to a puppet during a puppet show, and Bob did that puppet show. Also on an episode of The Wild Wild West called Night of the Puppeteer, about a mad puppeteer who's killing off people that did him dirt, Bob did the puppets and that and so forth. So whenever they needed a specialist to do marionettes, it was very often him. I think the start of Bob's work doing creature puppeteering was Roger Corman's Monster from the Ocean Floor. This was one of Roger's very, very first films. If it wasn't his first monster movie, it was one of the first two or three. And the film required a giant octopus. The poster had this gargantuan octopus attacking this gorgeous gal in a bathing suit, and it looked fairly spectacular for what it was. And of course, Roger didn't deliver in those days. It was all about selling the sizzle and not the steak. So Bob initially created a kind of octopoidal creature for it, and it just didn't work. He wasn't happy with it, and Roger wasn't happy with it. So he went back and reshot it in what he called a kind of Black Maria in his backyard with a sort of very, very simple underwater set. The climax of the movie has this little submersible crashing into the creature's eye. Bob remembered that when they were filming, when he had done it, Roger said, "Well, aren't you going to put little water droplets all over everything in there?" And he said, "Roger, everything under the ocean's wet." You can see it's very inexpensively done, as Roger's creatures were so often in those days. It only appears a couple of times throughout the movie, and it's seen in the ocean, and there's some sort of double exposure transparency, and then it has its big scene at the end. It was not Bob or Roger's most distinguished work, but it sure is memorable, and it's a lot of fun. It's a drive-in monster movie called Monster from the Ocean Floor. What do you want?
Is there life on Mars? For centuries we have wondered. Now, for the first time, through the new photographic miracle of Cinemagic, you will see the wonders of this strange and terrifying world when you see the Angry Red Planet.
One of Bob's most memorable movie creatures is in Ib Melchior's movie, The Angry Red Planet. Ib was an extraordinarily intelligent and talented man who turned to making relatively low budget, well thought out, surprisingly good science fiction movies like The Time Travelers and Journey to the Seventh Planet and so forth. And The Angry Red Planet's a fascinating movie. Of course, its presentation of the planet Mars is completely inaccurate and so forth, but it's a lot more interesting than the one God made. There's a scene in the movie where the main characters approach what they think are trees or plants and start hacking away at it for a sample, and it turns out to be this creature that has alternately been called the bat rat spider and the bat rat crab spider and all of this, and it has this sort of rat's body, a rat's tail, I think 6 legs with claws on the ends, and sort of little rat leg arms at the front. Herman Townsley, an effects director, designed and created the creature, and he made it exceedingly light, very, very light. I mean, it barely weighed more than a couple of ounces, partly because he could suspend it on very, very fine wire, and he had created an acid that they could cover the wires with that would make them disappear on camera. It weakened them, but it also kept them invisible. The trouble was, without an actual trained puppeteer, it had this awful Jerry Anderson wobbliness to the nth degree. They eventually had to bring in Bob, and he would know what to do with it, but it's a fairly complex piece of puppeteering in spite of how silly it might look to a lot of people now. It had the arms, the legs, the jaw, the head, the tail, all of these other pieces had to be kept moving believably. And at the climax of the scene, one of the astronauts, played by Jack Crucian, hits the thing with a sort of sonic ray, and its eyes go white, and it goes blind, and it shrieks. But it's a very, very memorable scene, and that creature seems to have struck a nerve with monster lovers. The Misfits even put it on the cover of their Walk Among Us album. Inevitably, Bob wound up working with Walt Disney. I say inevitably because his puppeteering and his puppet craftsmanship and so forth dovetailed beautifully with what Disney and Disneyland were doing. One of Bob's most memorable little bits in a Disney movie is in Escape to Witch Mountain, which is a beloved 70s kids movie. It's about these 2 alien children on Earth named Tony and Tia who have telekinetic powers. They're superhuman, and at one point they are being held and studied by this evil millionaire played by Ray Milland, and they have a little puppet theater and puppets, and it comes to life. What makes the scene so memorable is the marionette controllers are puppeteering themselves, and it looks as if some sort of invisible puppeteer is at work. In reality, they had a scaffolding above it with Bob and his other puppeteers who were manipulating these controllers from above and making the puppets do exactly what they normally would have if there had been a puppeteer there. And in that scene, you can actually see a kind of lady bird puppet in a flapper dress that was an ongoing character in Bob's puppet shows for decades. I imagine the theater still has her. One of Bob's more memorable creatures on TV was on the Star Trek episode The Man Trap. There's a scene where in the botany division, they have this creature called a weeper plant, and it's called alternately Beauregard or Gertrude because its gender is in question. And it was a hand puppet in the midst of this plant, and it screams and hollers when it senses that a member of the Enterprise's crew is an alien and then retracts. And that was just Bob's hand in a kind of glove. And it's an amazingly effective little bit of puppeteering. Another Disney favorite that Bob worked on was Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which is one of my favorites, where Angela Lansbury plays a witch named Eglantine, who is working on a spell called substitutionary locomotion, where she can make inanimate objects come to life. And again, with the sort of puppeteered telekinesis, he has various objects lifting and moving around and so forth. Now, Bob did not do the epic climax where suits of armor and military uniforms and so forth form a kind of a ghostly army and attack the Nazis who are invading this little seaside town at the end. That was just too complex for them. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of puppets involved, so I believe Ward Kimball from Disney took over and did that.
Traffic is approaching head on, ultra right, and really moving. They're right by us right now.
Asked him if you want to report officially.
EWA 517, do you want to report a UFO? Over.
One of Bob's most famous movie puppets, and one of the most fleetingly glimpsed, is in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Now, originally for the climax of the film, where Roy Neary, Richard Dreyfuss, and Francois Truffaut, and all the others finally encounter the aliens and interact with them, Steven Spielberg had envisioned literally dozens of puppets, very tall, lean puppets. So he had Bob do a prototype, and it's about maybe 5 feet tall, made fairly simply from dowel rods and things, and I think something like saran wrap, some sort of clear wrapping, with translucent skin, and I believe it originally had a beating heart. It was just a simple string, relatively simple string puppet, but because Spielberg was so busy, he kept being unable to see it when Bob would bring it around. And then finally, when he did come in, Bob told Cine Fantastique that he was so surprised by how unprepossessing Spielberg looked, and there was so little fanfare about him coming in. He just thought he was another guy and was showing it to him, and then he got incredibly embarrassed because he realized who he was talking to. There wasn't an entourage or anything around him. So Spielberg was fairly impressed and just sort of let it go, and ultimately they didn't use it in the film initially. But as they were preparing for previews and so forth, they went back and thought, we really should have this spectacular puppet in there. So Douglas Trumbull, one of the most extraordinary visual effects directors of all time, directed this little sequence where they built a very simple set involving a kind of gantry and a hatchway to the ship with all of this enormous light flooding out, this enormous quantity of light. And the puppet stands up and uncoils itself and spreads its arm out in this sort of these arms out in this welcoming gesture. And it's one of the most integral and touching moments in the film. I think it's undoubtedly Bob's most famous contribution to any movie. Seeing a puppet show at the Bob Baker Theater really was a marvelous experience, especially just to watch the joy and the enthusiasm of the kids watching it. They believed it and loved it as generations upon generations upon generations have enjoyed this classic art form. Bob died at age 90 in 2014, and the fate of the Puppet Theater was in jeopardy for a little while. It's no longer at its former location, which was near downtown LA, but it has continued and it has thrived.